When Sarah Mitchell walked into that dimly lit parking garage at 11:47 p.m., she looked like every predator's dream target, a petite woman in business attire, alone and seemingly vulnerable. The three men who had been following her for the past 6 blocks were about to learn why appearances can be fatally deceptive. What they didn't know was that behind those tired eyes and that unassuming frame was someone who had survived the most brutal military training program in the world, someone who had been forged in the crucible of Navy SEAL preparation, and someone who was about to remind them that the most dangerous weapon is often the one you never see coming. Sarah Mitchell had always been small. At 5'4" and barely 120 pounds, she had spent most of her life hearing the same refrains from well-meaning friends and family members. You need to be more careful. Don't walk alone at night. Maybe you should take a self-defense class. What none of them knew, what she had kept hidden for the past 8 years since leaving active duty, was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any ordinary woman walking through the streets of downtown Seattle. The rain had been falling steadily since early afternoon, turning the October evening into a misty grey tableau that seemed to swallow sound and shadow alike. Sarah pulled her coat tighter as she made her way from the financial district office building, where she now worked as a security consultant. It was a far cry from her previous life, but it paid the bills and allowed her to blend into civilian society in a way that felt almost surreal after everything she had been through. The transition hadn't been easy. After washing out of Navy SEAL training, officially of course since women weren't allowed in the program, Sarah had spent 3 years in a classified special operations unit that didn't officially exist. The training had been identical to SEAL preparation, minus the public recognition and the Trident pin. She had endured Hell Week, survived underwater demolitions training, mastered advanced combat techniques, and learned to kill with her bare hands. But all of that felt like a lifetime ago now. These days, Sarah Mitchell wore pencil skirts and carried a briefcase instead of tactical gear and assault rifles. She attended corporate meetings about cybersecurity protocols rather than mission briefings about enemy positions. Her hands, once calloused from rappelling ropes and weapon grips, were now soft from typing reports and shaking hands with clients. To everyone around her, she was just another professional woman trying to make it in a competitive business world. But some things never leave you, no matter how hard you try to bury them. As Sarah walked through the nearly empty streets toward the parking garage where she had left her Honda Civic, she noticed them. 3 men, keeping pace about half a block behind her. In her previous life, this kind of situational awareness had been second nature, drilled into her through countless hours of surveillance training and urban warfare exercises. In civilian life, she had tried to suppress those instincts, to be normal, to not see threats around every corner. Tonight, though, something felt different. The first man was tall and lean, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured most of his face. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself to be the predator in this situation. The second was shorter but broader, his shoulders straining against a worn leather jacket. He kept his hands buried deep in his pockets, and Sarah's trained eye caught the telltale bulge that suggested he was carrying something heavy. The third man hung back slightly, serving as a lookout, his head constantly swiveling to check for witnesses or escape routes. They were good, Sarah had to admit. They maintained just enough distance to avoid seeming obvious, while staying close enough to close the gap quickly when the opportunity presented itself. They varied their pace naturally, stopping occasionally to look in shop windows or check their phones. To an untrained observer, they might have just been 3 friends heading in the same direction on a rainy Tuesday night. But Sarah Mitchell was far from an untrained observer. She had first noticed them outside her office building, though they had probably been watching her much longer than that. The way they had positioned themselves suggested advanced reconnaissance. They knew her routine, knew which exit she would use, knew the route she typically took to reach the parking garage. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was planned. Sarah's mind automatically shifted into tactical assessment mode, a mental process she hadn't consciously engaged in for years but which felt as natural as breathing. 3 opponents, likely armed, definitely coordinated. Urban environment with limited visibility due to weather conditions. Minimal civilian foot traffic to provide either help or complications. Multiple escape routes available, but all required passing through potential ambush points. She could have called the police, of course. Could have ducked into one of the few businesses that were still open, could have gotten into a taxi, could have done any number of things that a normal person would do when they suspected they were being followed. But there was something about the way these men moved, something about their practiced coordination and patient stalking, that told her they wouldn't be deterred by simple evasion tactics. These weren't desperate amateurs looking for a quick grab-and-dash robbery. These were professionals, and they had marked her for a reason. Sarah's pace remained steady and unhurried as she continued toward the parking garage. To anyone watching, she appeared completely oblivious to the danger following her. She even stopped once to check her phone, using the reflection in a store window to get a better look at her pursuers. The leader had closed the distance slightly, now only about 30 feet behind her. His companions had spread out, creating a loose triangle formation that would make it difficult for her to run in any direction without encountering at least one of them. They were definitely planning to take her in the parking garage. It made tactical sense from their perspective. The garage would be largely empty at this hour, with concrete walls that would muffle any screams or sounds of struggle. The entrance and exit points were limited and easily controlled. Most importantly, there would be no witnesses and no immediate help available. What they couldn't have known was that Sarah Mitchell had trained for exactly this type of scenario dozens of times during her military service. Urban combat, close quarters engagement, multiple opponent scenarios, these had been staples of her preparation for missions that most people would never know had taken place. She had learned to turn environmental disadvantages into tactical advantages, to use an opponent's assumptions and overconfidence against them. As she approached the parking garage entrance, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of time beginning to slow down. It was something that had happened during combat situations in her military days, a psychological phenomenon that her instructors had called bullet time. Her senses sharpened, her breathing deepened and regulated automatically, and her mind began processing information at an accelerated rate. She could hear their footsteps now, no longer bothering to maintain stealth since they assumed she was trapped. The leader had quickened his pace and was now less than 20 feet behind her. She could hear the rustle of his clothing and the slight scrape of his shoes against the wet pavement. His breathing was slightly elevated, suggesting adrenaline and anticipation. The parking garage loomed ahead of her, its entrance yawning like the mouth of some concrete predator. The overhead lights created pools of harsh illumination separated by deep shadows. Her car was parked on the 3rd level, but Sarah had no intention of making it that far. She was going to end this in the stairwell. Sarah pushed through the heavy glass door that led to the garage stairwell, allowing it to swing shut behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. The space was narrow and utilitarian, with concrete stairs leading upward and fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. The walls were painted institutional green and covered with a thin film of urban grime that seemed to absorb sound. Perfect. She climbed exactly 12 steps before stopping and turning around. To her pursuers, it would appear that she had finally realized she was being followed and was now trapped and panicking. They would expect her to plead, to offer them her purse or her jewelry, to break down in tears and beg for mercy. They were about to discover just how wrong their assumptions were. The door opened with a metallic clang, and the first man stepped through. He was older than Sarah had initially thought, probably in his 40s, with graying stubble and eyes that held the flat, emotionless gaze of someone who had done this many times before. He smiled when he saw her standing on the stairs, a predatory expression that revealed yellowed teeth. "Well, well," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. "Looks like you finally figured out you were being followed. Smart girl." His companions filed in behind him, effectively blocking the only exit. The second man, the one with the leather jacket, pulled his hands from his pockets to reveal a length of rope and a roll of duct tape. The third man produced a knife, a wicked-looking blade that he held with practiced familiarity. "Here's how this is going to work," the leader continued, taking a step up the stairs toward her. "You're going to come with us quietly, and nobody gets hurt. We just want to have a little conversation with you about some of the work you've been doing lately." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized this wasn't a random attack at all. Somehow, someone had connected her current identity with her past military service. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had she been compromised? Was this related to one of her old missions? Or was this connected to her current work as a security consultant? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, allowing a tremor to enter her voice. "I'm just an office worker. I don't have any money or—" "Cut the act," the leader interrupted. "We know exactly who you are, Sarah. Or should I say, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, formerly of a unit that doesn't officially exist." "Yeah, we know all about your little secret." The confirmation hit her like a physical blow. These men weren't just criminals. They were connected to someone with access to classified military records. Someone who knew about her past and wanted her for reasons that definitely weren't good. The rope and duct tape weren't for a simple robbery. They were planning to take her somewhere for interrogation, torture, or worse, which meant she was no longer bound by the rules of civilian engagement. Sarah's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The trembling stopped, her posture straightened, and when she looked down at the three men, it was with the cold, calculating gaze of a trained killer who had just been given permission to do what she did best. "You know what?" she said, her voice now steady and completely devoid of fear. "You absolutely right. I am Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, and you gentlemen have just made the last mistake of your lives." The leader's confident smile faltered slightly. Something in her tone, in the way she was standing, had triggered an instinctive warning in his predator brain. But it was too late to reconsider. He had committed to this course of action, and backing down now would make him look weak in front of his companions. "Big talk for someone who's outnumbered 3-1, he said, though his voice lacked the casual confidence it had held moments before. Sarah smiled, and it was the expression that would have looked perfectly at home on the face of a hunting shark. "Outnumbered?" she repeated. "You poor, stupid bastards. You're not outnumbered. You're target practice." The first man lunged up the stairs toward her, reaching out with hands that were probably accustomed to grabbing helpless victims. What he got instead was a brutal lesson in what 8 years of the most intensive combat training in the world could produce. Sarah moved like liquid lightning. Her right foot lashed out in a precise arc that caught the leader's extended wrist, snapping the bone with an audible crack. Before he could even register the pain, her left hand shot forward in a knife-hand strike that crushed his larynx. His eyes went wide with shock, and he staggered backward, clutching his throat and making horrible gasping sounds as his body fought for air that would no longer come. The man with the knife reacted first, charging up the stairs with his blade extended. Sarah dropped low, sweeping his legs and sending him crashing face first into the concrete wall. The sound of his nose breaking was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. As he bounced off the wall, Sarah grabbed his wrist and twisted sharply, forcing him to drop the knife before driving her elbow into his temple. He dropped like a marionette with cut strings. The third man, seeing his companions neutralized in less than 10 seconds, made the smart choice and turned to run. Unfortunately for him, Sarah Mitchell had been trained to ensure that enemy combatants never escaped to report back or seek reinforcement. She vaulted over the railing and dropped 8 feet to land directly behind him just as he reached for the door handle. Her arms snaked around his neck in a perfect rear naked choke, cutting off the blood flow to his brain with surgical precision. He clawed at her arm for perhaps 30 seconds before going limp. The entire encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes. Sarah stood in the sudden silence of the stairwell, surrounded by 3 unconscious or dying men, and felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and emptiness that she remembered from her military days. The skills were still there, honed to a razor's edge despite years of civilian life. She was still the weapon that her government had spent millions of dollars creating. But now she had to figure out who had sent these men and why they wanted her badly enough to risk exposing themselves in such a direct manner. More importantly, she had to decide what to do with the knowledge that her carefully constructed civilian identity had been blown. Sarah Mitchell, the security consultant, would have called the police and waited for them to sort everything out, but Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell knew that this was just the beginning, and that whoever was behind this attack wouldn't give up just because their first attempt had failed. As she stood over the bodies of her attackers, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop pretending to be someone she wasn't. It was time to remember exactly who she had been trained to be. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, she would be the one doing the hunting. The police sirens were still wailing in the distance when Sarah Mitchell walked calmly out of the parking garage's rear exit, leaving behind a scene that would puzzle investigators for months to come. She had taken exactly 4 minutes to search her attackers for identification and clues, finding nothing but burner phones, cash, and weapons that had been professionally sanitized of any identifying marks. These weren't street criminals or desperate amateurs. They were military contractors, mercenaries, the kind of people who got hired when someone wanted a job done quietly and permanently. Sarah's Honda Civic remained exactly where she had parked it 3 levels up, but she would never see it again. That car belonged to Sarah Mitchell, the security consultant, a woman who had just ceased to exist. The person walking through the rain-soaked streets of Seattle was someone else entirely, someone who had been dormant for 8 years but was now fully awake and operational. The safe house was located in a run-down industrial district south of downtown, tucked between an abandoned warehouse and a truck repair shop that had been closed for business since the economic downturn. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another empty building with boarded windows and graffiti-covered walls. But Sarah knew that appearances were carefully crafted to be deceiving. She entered through a service door that appeared to be secured with a rusted padlock that actually opened to a touch, having been fitted with an electronic lock that responded to the specific pressure pattern and timing that had been drilled into her muscle memory during training. The interior was dark and seemingly empty, but Sarah moved through it with the confidence of someone who had memorized every detail of the layout years ago. The basement held her real treasures. Behind a false wall that looked like solid concrete was a room that contained everything Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell might need to resume her former life. Military-grade weapons, ammunition, surveillance equipment, communication devices, forged identification documents, cash in multiple currencies, and most importantly, a secure computer terminal that could access networks that didn't officially exist. Sarah had hoped she would never need any of it again. She had built this safe house during her transition to civilian life, telling herself it was just paranoia, just the inability of a former soldier to fully trust that she was truly safe in the civilian world. She had checked on it periodically over the years, maintained the equipment, updated the documents, but always with the fervent hope that it would remain nothing more than an expensive insurance policy. Tonight, that investment was about to pay dividends. The computer terminal hummed to life with a series of authentication protocols that would have impressed most cybersecurity experts. Sarah's fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced efficiency, navigating through layers of encryption and security measures to access databases that were supposed to have been permanently sealed. Her clearance should have been revoked years ago, but government bureaucracy moved slowly, and certain systems never quite caught up with personnel changes in black operations units. What she found in those files made her blood run cold. Operation Nightfall, a mission she had participated in 7 years ago during her final active duty assignment. The target had been a weapons dealer named Viktor Kozlov, a Russian oligarch who had been selling military-grade hardware to terrorist organizations. The mission had been simple in concept: infiltrate his compound in Montenegro, gather intelligence on his network, and eliminate him before he could complete a deal that would have put advanced surface-to-air missiles in the hands of people who wanted to use them against civilian aircraft. Sarah remembered every detail of that mission with crystal clarity. The month of preparation, studying Kozlov's habits and security arrangements. The insertion via underwater approach, during a fierce storm that had provided perfect cover. The careful infiltration of his heavily guarded estate. The discovery that Kozlov wasn't just selling weapons but was also running a human trafficking operation that supplied young women to wealthy buyers across Europe. She remembered the moment when the mission parameters had changed from intelligence gathering to immediate elimination. She remembered the fight in Kozlov's private office, the way his bodyguards had died silently in the darkness before they could raise an alarm. She remembered looking into Kozlov's eyes as she explained to him exactly why he was about to die and what would happen to his organization. Most of all, she remembered the files she had discovered in his safe, files that detailed not just his criminal enterprises, but also the names and locations of his clients, his suppliers, and his partners. Those files had been transmitted back to headquarters and had supposedly been used to roll up an entire network of international criminals. But according to what Sarah was reading now, those files had never been fully acted upon. Kozlov's death had been reported as a heart attack, his organization had been quietly taken over by parties unknown, and several of the people named in his files had not only avoided prosecution, but had actually expanded their operations in the years since. Someone had buried Operation Nightfall, and everything it had uncovered. Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she scrolled through page after page of classified reports, memos, and communications that painted a picture of corruption and conspiracy that reached far higher into the government than she had ever imagined. The mission that she had been told was crucial to national security had actually been a cover for something much darker. Someone had wanted Viktor Kozlov dead not because he was selling weapons to terrorists, but because he knew too much about who was really behind those sales. And now, 7 years later, someone wanted Sarah dead for the same reason. The attack tonight hadn't been random. It had been specifically timed to occur after she had started working as a security consultant for several defense contractors. Someone was worried that her new position might give her access to information that could help her piece together what had really happened during Operation Nightfall. Someone who had enough resources and connections to identify her, despite her carefully constructed civilian identity. Sarah continued digging through the files, following digital breadcrumbs that led her deeper and deeper into a conspiracy that involved weapons sales, human trafficking, money laundering, and political corruption on a scale that made her former target look like a small-time criminal. Names began to emerge from the data, names that she recognized from news reports and congressional hearings, names that belonged to people with the power to bury operations and eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The pattern became clear as she worked through the night. Operation Nightfall hadn't been designed to stop Viktor Kozlov's criminal enterprise. It had been designed to take it over. Someone in the American government had been working with Kozlov, using his network to move weapons and money for their own purposes. When Kozlov had started becoming a liability, demanding a larger share of the profits, or threatening to expose his American partners, they had arranged for his elimination. Sarah had been the unwitting assassin in a mob hit disguised as a patriotic mission. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Everything she had believed about her service, about the mission she had undertaken, about the people she had killed in the name of protecting her country, had been a lie. She had been used as a tool by the very people she had sworn to serve, manipulated into committing murders that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with protecting corrupt officials and their criminal enterprises. But she had also been a witness, someone who had seen the files, who had been inside Kozlov's operation, who could potentially identify the American connections if she ever started asking the right questions. That made her a liability that had to be managed. For 8 years, they had been content to simply monitor her, making sure she remained safely embedded in civilian life, with no interest in looking too deeply into her past missions. But when she had taken the job with the defense contracting firm, when she had started working with classified systems and databases again, someone had decided that the risk was too great. The attack tonight had been meant to look like a random crime, 3 men attempting to rob or assault a lone woman in a parking garage. If it had succeeded, Sarah's body would have been found days later in some remote location, another victim of urban violence. Her death would have warranted perhaps a brief mention in the local news before being forgotten entirely. Instead, 3 professional killers were now dead or dying, and Sarah Mitchell had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the defense establishment, which meant the people behind this would have no choice but to escalate. Sarah was still absorbed in the classified files when the perimeter alarms began sounding. Motion sensors, thermal detectors, and acoustic monitors all activated simultaneously, indicating multiple contacts approaching the building from several directions. She glanced at the security monitors and felt her blood turn to ice water. 12 men in tactical gear, moving with military precision, were surrounding her safe house. They wore no identifying patches or insignia, but their equipment and formation suggested special operations background. These weren't the same kind of hired criminals who had attacked her in the parking garage. These were professionals, probably former military personnel who now worked for private contractors with government connections. Someone had tracked her here, which meant they had resources and capabilities that she had seriously underestimated. Sarah began shutting down the computer terminal and gathering essential equipment. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they breached the building, maybe 3 if she was lucky. The safe house had been designed with multiple escape routes, but all of them would be dangerous, with this many hostiles in the area. She was strapping on body armor and checking weapons when she heard the first explosion. They were using breaching charges on the main entrance following standard urban assault procedures. The sound echoed through the building like thunder, shaking dust from the ceiling and causing several of her monitors to flicker. Sarah activated the building's defensive systems, measures she had installed but hoped never to use. Smoke canisters began filling the upper floors with thick, choking clouds that would interfere with thermal imaging and night vision equipment. Motion-activated strobes started flashing in random patterns, designed to disorient attackers and make accurate shooting nearly impossible. But she knew these measures would only slow them down, not stop them. The sound of boots on the floor above told her they were already inside and moving to clear the building room by room. They were good, she had to admit. Their movement was coordinated and methodical, exactly the kind of systematic approach she would have used in their position. Sarah made her way to the primary escape route, a tunnel that connected the basement to the storm drain system beneath the street. It was cramped and unpleasant, but it would get her out of the immediate kill zone and give her room to maneuver. She was halfway through the tunnel when she heard the explosion behind her. They had found the basement and were blasting their way through her defensive barriers. She could hear shouted commands and the distinctive sound of tactical radios crackling with communications. The tunnel opened into a concrete drainage channel that ran beneath the industrial district. Sarah emerged into the darkness, soaked from the shallow water that flowed along the bottom, and began making her way toward a predetermined extraction point 6 blocks away. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of her safe house being systematically destroyed. They would find evidence that she had been there, but they would also discover that their target had escaped once again. That would force them to make a choice: escalate further or try to disappear and hope she couldn't trace the attack back to them. Sarah knew which option they would choose. People who operated at this level didn't get to where they were by backing down when things got complicated. They would double down, bringing in more resources, more personnel, and more sophisticated methods, which was exactly what she was counting on. As she moved through the drainage tunnels beneath Seattle, Sarah Mitchell began planning her counterattack. She had been on the defensive since this began, reacting to their moves instead of making her own. That was about to change. The people behind this conspiracy had made two critical mistakes. First, they had underestimated what she was capable of, assuming that 8 years of civilian life had made her soft and unprepared. Second, and more importantly, they had revealed themselves by coming after her directly. Now she knew they existed. Now she had names, faces, and connections to investigate. Now she had a target. Sarah emerged from the storm drain system in a different part of the city, where she had positioned additional resources and backup identities years ago. By dawn, she would have new documents, new weapons, and a new base of operations. More importantly, she would have a plan. The people who had sent those men after her thought they were hunting a frightened former soldier trying to hide in civilian life. They were about to learn that they had actually awakened something much more dangerous, a highly trained special operations veteran with nothing left to lose and every reason to seek vengeance. The war was just beginning, and Sarah Mitchell intended to win it. 3 weeks after the attack in the parking garage, Sarah Mitchell no longer existed. In her place was Rebecca Torres, a freelance investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing government corruption and a talent for getting sources to talk about things they probably shouldn't discuss. The transformation had been thorough and professional, complete with a convincing backstory, published articles under her new name, and even social media accounts that showed years of apparently authentic activity. But Rebecca Torres was just another mask, another identity designed to serve a specific purpose in Sarah's carefully orchestrated campaign of vengeance and revelation. She had spent the past 3 weeks mapping out the conspiracy that had tried to kill her, following the digital and financial breadcrumbs that connected Operation Nightfall to a web of corruption that stretched from defense contractors to congressional oversight committees to the highest levels of military intelligence. What she had discovered was worse than anything she had initially suspected. The conspiracy wasn't just about covering up a single illegal operation. It was about systematically using classified military missions to eliminate obstacles to a vast criminal enterprise that generated billions of dollars in illegal profits. Weapon sales, human trafficking, drug smuggling, money laundering through defense contracts, political assassinations disguised as military operations. The scope was breathtaking in its ambition and horrifying in its execution. At the center of it all was a man named General Harrison Blackwood, a decorated veteran who had served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to a senior position in the Defense Intelligence Agency. On paper, Blackwood was a patriot and a hero, the kind of soldier that politicians loved to cite when they needed to demonstrate their support for the military. In reality, he was the architect of a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for over a decade. Blackwood had been Victor Kozlov's primary American contact, using his position in military intelligence to provide protection and information in exchange for a substantial cut of the profits. When Kozlov had started demanding a larger share and threatening to expose the American connections, Blackwood had arranged for Operation Nightfall, using Sarah and her team to eliminate his former partner while maintaining plausible deniability. But Kozlov's death hadn't ended the criminal enterprise. If anything, it had allowed Blackwood to consolidate control and expand operations. The network that Sarah had helped destroy 7 years ago had simply been restructured under new management, with Blackwood and his conspirators taking over the most profitable aspects of the business. Now, as Rebecca Torres, Sarah had managed to get close enough to document the conspiracy and gather evidence that could bring down everyone involved. But she had also discovered something that changed everything. Blackwood and his people knew she was still alive and were actively hunting her with resources that included not just private contractors, but also official military personnel who believed they were pursuing a rogue agent who had gone insane and started killing American operatives. They had turned her into the villain in their narrative, painting her as a dangerous traitor who had to be stopped at all costs. The irony wasn't lost on her. The people who had betrayed everything she had sworn to protect were now using the system she had served to hunt her down like a criminal. They had twisted the truth so completely that good soldiers and agents were unknowingly helping them cover up their crimes. Sarah knew she had one chance to expose the conspiracy before they found her again. But it would require her to do something that went against every instinct she had developed during her years of clandestine operations. She would have to go public, to step out of the shadows and reveal everything she had discovered to the world. The meeting was arranged for midnight at the Lincoln Memorial, a location chosen for its symbolic significance and its practical advantages. The memorial would be largely empty at that hour, but the area was well lit and provided multiple escape routes if things went wrong. More importantly, it was a place where the truth mattered, where the ideals that Sarah had fought for were literally carved in stone. Her contact was James Morrison, a veteran journalist who had spent his career exposing government corruption and who had the connections necessary to ensure that Sarah's story would reach the right people. Morrison had been investigating defense contract fraud for months and had already published articles that had raised questions about some of the people connected to Blackwood's network. Sarah arrived early, using the time to conduct surveillance and ensure that the meeting location hadn't been compromised. She positioned herself on the steps of the memorial, dressed in dark clothing that would blend into the shadows, and waited for Morrison to arrive. He appeared exactly at midnight, walking up the steps with the measured pace of someone who had covered dangerous stories in dangerous places. Morrison was older than she had expected, probably in his 60s, with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen more of the world's ugliness than most people could handle. "Rebecca Torres?" he asked quietly as he approached her position. "That's one of my names," Sarah replied. "Thank you for coming." Morrison sat down beside her on the marble steps, his eyes constantly scanning the area for potential threats. He had clearly done this kind of thing before. "Your message mentioned evidence of a conspiracy involving military operations and defense contracts," he said. "That's a serious accusation to make without proof." Sarah handed him a flash drive that contained copies of everything she had discovered over the past 3 weeks. Financial records, classified communications, mission reports, surveillance footage, and documented connections between official military operations and criminal enterprises. "Everything you need is on there," she said. "Names, dates, bank accounts, operational details. Enough to bring down a network that's been operating for over a decade." Morrison pocketed the flash drive without examining it. "Why come to me? Why not take this to the FBI, or to Congress, or to the Inspector General's office?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and without humor. "Because half the people who should be investigating this are either part of it or being paid to look the other way. The corruption goes deep enough that I can't trust official channels. It has to be exposed publicly, all at once, before they can contain it or spin it." "And what about you?" Morrison asked. "If I publish this story, you'll be painting a target on your back that will never go away. People with this much money and power don't just give up when they're exposed. They fight back. They're already trying to kill me," Sarah replied. "At least this way, their efforts will be public instead of hidden." Morrison nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. "This is going to require verification. I'll need to check these documents, confirm the sources, cross-reference the information with what I already know about some of these people. That could take weeks." "We don't have weeks," Sarah said. "They know I'm still alive and they're getting desperate. Every day we wait is another day they have to cover their tracks and eliminate witnesses." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching helicopters began echoing across the National Mall. Sarah's head snapped up, her trained senses immediately identifying the distinctive sound of military aircraft moving at high speed and low altitude. "Time's up," she said, grabbing Morrison's arm. "They found us." The first helicopter appeared over the reflecting pool, its searchlight cutting through the darkness like a white-hot blade. Sarah could see tactical teams preparing to repel from the aircraft, their silhouettes clearly visible against the night sky. "Run," she told Morrison. "Get that information published. Don't let them bury this." Morrison was already moving, his years of experience in dangerous situations overriding any impulse to ask questions or hesitate. He disappeared into the shadows between the memorial columns, heading for the tree line that would provide cover from the helicopters. Sarah went in the opposite direction, drawing attention away from the journalist and toward herself. She had expected this moment ever since she had started her investigation, and she was as ready for it as anyone could be. The first tactical team hit the ground running, their movements coordinated and professional. Sarah counted 8 men, all armed with assault rifles and wearing night vision equipment. They spread out in a standard search pattern, using hand signals to communicate their positions and observations. Sarah had positioned herself behind one of the massive marble columns, using the shadow and her dark clothing to remain invisible to their electronic surveillance. She had weapons, a pistol and several knives, but she also knew that using them would only confirm their narrative that she had gone rogue and become a terrorist. Instead, she waited until the first soldier was close enough to touch before moving. Her hand clamped over his mouth while her arms snaked around his throat, cutting off his air supply with practiced precision. He struggled for perhaps 10 seconds before going limp. Sarah lowered him gently to the ground and appropriated his radio and night vision equipment. "Alpha 2, report your position," came the voice through the radio. Sarah keyed the microphone and replied in the unconscious soldier's voice, which she had heard clearly enough to mimic convincingly. "Alpha 2, moving to search the north side. No contact yet." The deception would only work for a few minutes, but it might be enough to create confusion and buy her additional time to escape. Sarah moved through the memorial like a ghost, using every piece of cover and concealment available to avoid detection. She could hear the tactical teams coordinating their search, closing the net around her position with methodical efficiency. But they were looking for a panicked fugitive, not a highly trained special operations veteran who had been preparing for this exact scenario. She made it to the tree line just as the second wave of helicopters arrived. These carried additional personnel and more sophisticated equipment, including thermal imaging systems that would make hiding much more difficult. Sarah knew she had perhaps 2 minutes before they detected her heat signature. The motorcycle was exactly where she had left it, hidden beneath camouflage netting in a grove of trees 200 meters from the memorial. Sarah had positioned emergency transportation at dozens of locations around Washington, D.C., anticipating that she might need to evacuate quickly from any number of meeting sites. She fired up the bike and accelerated through the trees, using pathways that were too narrow for vehicles and too covered for effective helicopter pursuit. Behind her, she could hear shouted commands and the sound of ground teams rushing to intercept her, but she was already moving too fast for them to catch. Sarah burst out of the tree line and onto Constitution Avenue, weaving between the sparse late-night traffic with the skill of someone who had been trained in tactical driving. The helicopters followed overhead, their searchlights tracking her movement, but she knew the city well enough to use overpasses and tunnels to break their line of sight. 20 minutes later, she abandoned the motorcycle in a parking garage in Arlington and disappeared into the metro system. By the time the tactical teams reached the garage, she was already 3 stops away and moving deeper into the urban labyrinth that would hide her until Morrison could publish his story. But even as she made her escape, Sarah knew that the real battle was just beginning. The people behind the conspiracy would throw everything they had at stopping the story from being published. They would use their influence to pressure editors, threaten sources, and discredit Morrison's reporting. They might even try to eliminate the journalist himself. Sarah spent the next 72 hours in a safe house in Baltimore, monitoring news reports and encrypted communications to gauge the reaction to her public exposure. She didn't have to wait long. Morrison's story hit the front page of the Washington Post on Thursday morning, accompanied by supporting articles from 3 other major newspapers that had been given portions of the evidence simultaneously. The headline read, "Military operations used to cover massive criminal conspiracy," and the subhead detailed allegations of weapons trafficking, human smuggling, and political corruption reaching to the highest levels of the defense establishment. The reaction was immediate and explosive. General Blackwood was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Several defense contractors saw their stock prices collapse as investors fled anything connected to the scandal. Congressional leaders called for immediate hearings and special prosecutors. The FBI announced the formation of a task force to investigate the allegations. But Sarah also saw the predictable attempts at damage control and spin. Blackwood's supporters claimed he was being framed by foreign intelligence services. Some media outlets suggested that the evidence had been fabricated by hostile nations seeking to undermine American military capabilities. There were calls to investigate Morrison himself, questioning his sources and his motivations. Most significantly, there was no mention of Sarah Mitchell in any of the coverage. Morrison had honored her request to keep her identity secret, referring only to classified sources and former military personnel in his reporting. That anonymity was her only protection now. As long as the conspirators didn't know exactly who had exposed them, she remained a ghost that they couldn't target directly. But Sarah knew that wouldn't last forever. Eventually, they would piece together her identity and come for her again. When they did, she would be ready. 3 months later, Sarah watched from the gallery as General Harrison Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial had been swift and decisive, with overwhelming evidence of his involvement in what prosecutors called the most extensive criminal conspiracy in modern military history. 17 other defendants had also been convicted, including defense contractors, government officials, and foreign operatives. The network that had operated in secret for over a decade had been completely dismantled, its assets seized, its victims compensated, and its leaders imprisoned. But Sarah knew that victory always came at a price. She had spent the months since the Lincoln Memorial incident living under yet another assumed identity, moving frequently and staying alert for any sign that her enemies had discovered her location. The stress of constant vigilance had worn on her, but it had also reminded her of who she truly was, beneath all the civilian disguises and peaceful facades. She was a soldier. She had been forged by the most intensive military training in the world, shaped by years of dangerous missions and life-or-death decisions. The 8 years she had spent trying to be someone else, trying to live a normal life, had been an attempt to deny her fundamental nature. Now, watching Blackwood being led away in shackles, Sarah finally understood that she couldn't go back to being a suburban security consultant. She couldn't pretend to be ordinary when she had been designed to be extraordinary, but she also couldn't return to active duty with a military that might still contain other conspirators, other corrupt officials who would see her as a threat to be eliminated. There was, however, a third option. The world was full of Victor Kozlovs and Harrison Blackwoods, criminals who hid behind patriotism and official positions while preying on the innocent and vulnerable. They operated in the shadows, protected by their wealth and connections, confident that they were untouchable. Sarah Mitchell could touch them. She could hunt them down, expose their crimes, and ensure that justice was served when official channels failed or were compromised. She could be what she had always been trained to be, a weapon aimed at those who deserved to face consequences for their actions. As she walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight, Sarah began planning her next mission. There were other networks to uncover, other conspiracies to expose, other predators who thought themselves beyond the reach of justice. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The woman who had once tried to disappear into civilian obscurity was gone forever. In her place was something much more dangerous. A hunter with the skills to find anyone, the training to defeat any opponent, and the determination to never stop fighting for what was right. They had thought they had her. Instead, they had awakened something that would hunt them for the rest of their lives. And Sarah Mitchell was very good at hunting.